Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 30. Um, Comic Pop, Back Issues has this tradition of whenever they reach a 10 or 100, or they used to have this tradition, that they would do one of the crisis events from DC Comics. I think they stopped doing that when they ran out of crises. But that just gave me the idea to talk about comic book crossovers, which I think I have three animals gathering around me right now, so that's why I had to pick up my phone. But it gave me the idea to talk about comic book crossovers. I think comic book crossovers represent a really underappreciated experimental fiction form. And so I've been spending plenty of time criticizing just the deeply problematic structure of fiction writing workshops. So I want to go ahead and ruin my credibility and talk about how comic book crossovers are an underappreciated experimental storytelling structure. I would worry about my credibility if I thought anyone was watching this. Hello, my grandkids. I have no credibility, my grandkids. Just as a reminder, I'm doing this in case I die any day now, so my grandkids know my beliefs on fiction writing, if that matters. So anyway, back to my point. The comic book crossover, I think it's underappreciated for its possibility as a narrative form for many, many reasons. Of course, the obvious reason being it's in the form of a comic book, a superhero comic, which is one of the lowest forms. The least respected. I don't personally say lowest, but one of the least respected, I should say, narrative forms. And there's a whole trend of appreciating comic books these days, but people make sure to call them graphic novels, and which is just a pet peeve of mine. When you're talking about comics, they're comics. When they come out serially every month in small floppies. Speaking of floppies, in short floppies, those are comic books. That's just what they are. So the comic book character is very popular, which tends to mean they don't get respected as being experimental. And one of my first episodes, I'm being eaten by my cat. One of my first episodes was about the MCU and why the MCU is such an amazing miracle in its existence. But even the MCU is a smaller form of that fairly complicated structure. And part of what makes it a miracle is it does it so well. Other movie franchises have tried to do that shared universe structure, and it hasn't worked. And arguably, comic book crossover structure, another reason why it's underappreciated, is because a lot of the times in the comics themselves, they don't work. Comic book fans, when they cite their favorite storylines, or they talk about what they really enjoy about comics, they don't tend to cite crossovers necessarily. There's an interesting sort of perspective on crossovers that, as they're coming out, we comic book nerds tend to complain about them a lot. But we look at them in retrospect in a positive light. For example, like Secret Invasion. I've heard all of these rumors about Secret Invasion becoming one of the MCU movies now that they did the Infinity Saga. People saying, well, next they should do Secret Invasion. I remember when Secret Invasion came out, everybody hated it. From what I could tell, I thought it was fine. I didn't hate it, but it was kind of okay. It had some story structure problems. As I said, as a story, how often can you say it really has succeeded? Honestly, even if we look back on, in retrospect and say, Secret Invasion was so great, they define eras. I think that's part of, especially the post Avengers Assembled, Avengers Assembled, House of M, Civil War. People mark the beginning of the newest line of crossovers with Civil War, but it was really Avengers Disassembled, House of M, Civil War, World War Hulk, Secret Invasion. That whole line, that's one of the recent, relatively recent, last 10 years, I guess, but probably back farther than that. I can't remember the exact year. 10, 12 years, something like that. That's been the recent development, and I think a big part of why people will look back on something like Secret Invasion or Civil War. Civil War is another one, definitely. That's sort of the iconic one. And they'll say, they'll have nostalgic feelings about it, or they'll have, the rosy image born from nostalgia more so than anything else, because it defines that particular era, not necessarily that the story really worked well. So I'm saying the structure has tremendous amount of potential, and it's very experimental and fascinating, and it's developed so much in so many different ways over the years. Far more so than printed fiction. I keep hoping for some sort of new development, but I'm really fascinated with 50s, 60s, and 70s experimental fiction, especially. I have John Barth sitting up here. I don't love John Barth. I appreciate John Barth. This is not my A team books right here. This is C team books. It just happens to be my background. This is why they're so randomly stacked. But John Barth, he had even though I've never really loved his fiction, Gyroscope Boy I kind of liked. Didn't really like Welcome to the Funhouse. Everybody cites that one. But he had an essay called, a commonly cited essay called Literature of Exhaustion, which just talks about how when a form becomes exhausted, when a narrative form becomes exhausted, it's necessary to invent a new one in order to revitalize the form. This is where the Rainbow Circle comes in. My friend, the Rainbow Circle. If the goal of narrative is to optimize the access to the visceral stimulation at the core, this is what my grandkids need to know. Not my opinions on comic book crossovers, but how does fiction work? Optimizing access to the visceral stimulation at the core. You have to consider the counter forces of destimulation, and familiarity is one of them, and that's what John Barth was identifying. Even though I personally, in an entirely subjective way, don't think he did a great job of that, entirely subjectively. Still, it's a valid point that he's talking about postmodernism, which is a name I hate, but just to justify the formal experimentation that happened with postmodernism. John Barth was creating lots and lots of different new forms, but his point was you have a literature of exhaustion in order for it to become a literature of replenishment. It becomes exhausted, so it reduces its capacity to stimulate. You create new forms in order to increase the stimulation. Arguably, fiction didn't go very far with changing the forms, and you could certainly make an argument that the structural experimentations didn't work well. If you look at something like Nabokov's Pale Fire, which is one of my favorite, I do love that one. One of my favorite structural experimentations. It's a book in the form of footnotes to a poem. It's really hard to pull off. He does it really well. But you had just what is called postmodernism. Just even though I hate that term, you had lots of pieces that were designed, like John Barth said, to replenish the form. But what do we have as a retaliation to that? Defaulting into domestic realism. And it coincided, this is sort of where it comes into my criticism of the workshop form. It coincides with the rise of the post-Iowa workshop form, where that type of piece, the non-experimental piece, fits the form of the workshop, so it gets just internally reinforced. So, I think that's, if you want to look historically, this is about a supposedly dumb subject. I don't think it's dumb, but a supposedly dumb subject of superheroes. But there's your bit of history lesson there. Things like Raymond Carver really rising in popularity in the 80s. In my experience, Raymond Carver is like the token workshop form guy. He has these simple realist pieces that don't have much formal experimentation. If you look at Cathedral, it's very, very tropey, and it's, this hugely tropey piece is held up, on this pedestal as the greatest piece of fiction ever. But I say that's literature of exhaustion. It's a very exhausted form. Whereas, on the flip side, superhero stories are called tropey and exhausted, and they can be, definitely. I mean, the form of a superhero story has been exhausted over and over again. But you can look at the evolution of the crossover structure as a way of revitalizing it. Potentially, part of the problem with the crossover structure, a lot of the times, is that it makes a lot of money because it's this big event, and so it does draw people in. And so because of that, it becomes a top-down sort of structure. And that can potentially be a problem when you have the company, Marvel, DC, whatever, from the top down saying we need to make this crossover in order to sell more books. That has the potential to be stifling on the form. But the successful crossover will still manage that. So, that's kind of the origin of the crossover, really, is if you go back to Secret Wars, depending on where you really want to identify the origin of the crossover. You look at Secret Wars, the whole title Secret Wars was very focus grouped. I've talked about focus grouping before. Focus grouping, which is what creative writing workshops are basically focus grouping. Focus grouping can normalize. It works with something that's already popular. And then focus group was the origin of the title Secret Wars. They identified what words are really popular, what words made something appealing for audiences to buy, secret and wars, putting those two together. It creates a parataxis. It's an interesting parataxis because those two don't really seem to belong together. Parataxis goes right here. Contradictions. It creates a parataxis, so it's more interesting than just merely being a focus group phrase. But if you look back at that kind of a crossover, it was essentially outside of continuity. And that's something that comic books as a narrative form, it's a very complicated narrative form. It gets accused of simplicity all the time. Comic books are very simple. Novels are very complicated. But if you look at a real basic, linear, realist novel, it goes in a straight line. Might go over a couple of generations or whatever. But structurally, it might be very, very, very simple. It might have a lot of things happening, but structurally it might be very simple. But just the nature of a shared universe for a comic, you have, just how many of our comics are out at the time. I'll say 52, because that is a number I can identify that DC at one point had out. That's a large number, so let's say 30 or something like that. Comic company might have 30 comic books going at a time. They're all moving along linearly, with the exception of a few, of course. Some might be flashback books or side universe books. They're all in the shared universe, so technically this is a universe, or the way they treat it, this is a universe where all of these things are happening simultaneously. So managing this simultaneous linear progression of 30 storylines, or even 20, or even 5 storylines progressing linearly is tricky. And then, so managing how all of those work together, you run across continuity problems, which is another really fascinating thing. I'll talk about that in a second. You run across continuity problems, of course, and they're all written by different writers, mostly, with exceptions like when Stan Lee was writing everything, nearly everything. So you're going to have contradictions, and so how do you manage 30 linear stories with all of these contradictions? The crossover is when you take those and you meld them together, or even just a small number of those, and you say, now they're all in the same story. So if you have these linear storylines going on, you have to work that into that storyline for each of the, how many ever are in the crossover. Work that into each of the storylines, and then when the crossover is over, you branch them out into their own storylines again. And that's an extraordinarily complicated structure. The whole idea that comic book stories are simple, yes, they do have arcs that are very tropey, but they're ongoing arcs that have been happening for 50, 60, 70 years. And they have to be familiar. This goes back to the familiarity novelty thing. They have to be familiar to a degree, just by the nature of the form, but they also have to be novel in order to stimulate. So how do you keep it fresh how do you keep one character who's been ongoing for, how many ever decades, keep that fresh? New characters come in and out constantly. But if you think about, like, Captain America, I have my Infinity Gauntlet. That's my favorite one, of course. You have Captain America, who's the oldest of all of these characters, and Hulk, they and Wolverine, and Cyclops, Spider-Man, of course. Yeah, these characters who have been, at the very least, most of them have been relatively continuously, maybe not the X-Men, but relatively continuously published since the 60s, since 63. Captain America goes back even farther than that. And so they're continuously having these arcs. They're going to be tropey just by the nature of the fact that they're having story arc after story arc every year, relatively, for, 56 years. Even longer for Captain America and Superman, and all the DC characters go back a little bit longer. So crossovers are a way of taking that structure and freshening it a little bit. They're not always successful, definitely. I would say Infinity Gauntlet is one of the rare cases where it's almost universally loved. It's my favorite, certainly. It's where I get my addiction into comics from. It's very directly from Infinity Gauntlet. My 3 favorite characters are the main characters in Infinity Gauntlet: Adam Warlock, Thanos, and Doctor Strange. Arguably the 3 main characters of Infinity Gauntlet. But the other misconception about comics, what they get accused of, they get accused of being simple, which is clearly not true. Structurally simple, clearly not true. They get accused of being plot-driven, and that's one of the common misconceptions of a comic book storyline. And one of the problems that comic book fans themselves tend to have with actual crossovers. Because a lot of the times crossovers are plot-driven, and that's the aspect of them that comic book fans tend to like the least. Comic book fans, arguably, love character-driven stories. Infinity Gauntlet's very character-driven, very much driven by this character. I think that's the success of a lot of the MCU movies, of Avengers Infinity War. It was very character-driven. It had a heavy plot, sure, but it was very much tied to characters. You cared about the characters, if you liked it. I think most people liked it. I don't know, but I'm sure there's plenty of the people who didn't. But it was very much driven by characters, arguably. Or in Endgame, there are plot holes in Endgame, but so what? I mean, it was emotionally intense. It was, there are plenty of plot developments that are problematic, but it was very, very much in service of the development of the characters. And so when a crossover fails, it tends to be because it's not character driven. And I think a part of the problem with the dichotomous treatment of character driven versus plot driven tends to be misconception that those are mutually exclusive. You can have a story that Maggie almost knocked over the phone. You can have a story. Let me stay right here so I can catch the phone if it falls. You can have a story that is plot driven and character driven. That's mind blowing, I'm sure. But if you think about, so I'll get into the specific example. So like Secret Wars. Secret Wars seems. Hey, what's up? How do you feel about comic book crossovers? Who's your favorite comic book character, huh? Is it Lockjaw? Is he your favorite comic book character? You are basically Lockjaw. Excuse me. Okay, you can stay right there. If you think of something like Secret Wars, it was very much focus grouped into existence, where basically the whole idea was it was designed to sell the toys. Did you realize that Secret Wars, one of the first comic book crossovers, was designed to sell the toys? But it was, all these characters who were going to be toys placed into this other world. Maggie wants to be in the movie too. Who were placed in this other world, and they fought each other like you would with toys, and it's very much a top-down sort of edict. But I think people who love Secret Wars, the original Secret Wars, not the Jonathan Hickman one, that's a whole much more complicated thing. Secret Wars, the original one, was very, very simple. It was, let's take all of the characters who are the toys and treat them like toys. Very much a top-down, plot-driven, arguably, just the original concept is plot-driven. But I think anyone who loves Secret Wars, what they love about it, if I had a comic book fan here, I could say, what's the best part of Secret Wars? They would say, that's easy. Doctor Doom, easily. The best part of Secret Wars. It's very much a Doctor Doom story. The Beyonder is, this super powerful character who takes all these other characters and puts them together to fight. And a lot of the stuff is kind of forgettable. Hulk has a great moment where he's holding up the mountain. They reference that in Endgame. That's one of the great Hulk moments. The other characters kind of acting in weird ways, like Colossus is having these weird sort of romantic things and forgetting about Shadowcat for random reasons. So it's not perfect character-wise, but the perfect character moments tend to be Doctor Doom's character moments. But the way that they, the structure of the simultaneous parallel linear development of stories, the way that they handled that was just by taking them out of the world and then putting them back in. And they made a couple of changes. That was sort of a precedent that they set at that point. That's where Spider-Man got his black costume, stuff like that. And so, you have sort of the complexities of trying to make this work with parallel linear stories, wanting to make it matter by making changes, but also trying to do that so it didn't mess up too many storylines. So, I'm not familiar with the linear storylines that were going on at the time. Why? Why do you want? What do you want? Okay. I wasn't familiar with the linear storylines going on at the time, and I couldn't quite track down, which storylines were interrupted by that. I don't think they were. Then you had In comparison with that, you do have a Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was the first really, really big DC crossover. They had little crossovers, certainly, just over the years, but that was the really big one. But they did it in order to fix their continuity. So they had these linear storylines, not exactly originally treated as the same universe, but then sort of melded into the same universe, and they had all these different timelines and stuff like that, and became this real confusing thing. I'm not a DC person, so I can't really explain it. But they created Crisis on Infinite Earths to really streamline and simplify everything. So that was designed, Secret Wars was designed not really to interrupt the parallel linear storylines. Crisis on Infinite Earths was designed very specifically to interrupt the linear storylines and then restart them. That's more of a DC sort of pattern. Marvel, the Secret Wars is, much more typical of Marvel. And that's what they did with the Infinity Gauntlet. The end of Infinity Gauntlet, they did kind of a similar thing with the other two parts of the trilogy, in Infinity War and Infinity Crusade, where they would have elements. They would have elements from the story popping up in the linear storyline. And really the ones that I know best are the Doctor Strange ones. That's really where I started reading Doctor Strange, was because of Infinity Gauntlet. But they would have the Doctor Strange ones, and it would be sort of a side story, and this is where the structure gets especially complicated. They sort of did something similar with Secret Wars 2, where the Beyonder would show up in all these different comics and sort of test people and what have you. And they did it for a while in the 80s, and there's so many crossovers. The X-Men did a lot of crossovers in the 80s in their own titles, and that was relatively easy because that's a smaller number of titles. So they would do like Inferno and Fall of the Mutants and Mutant Massacre and stuff like that, just inside of their own titles. In the 90s, they had tons of crossovers. Those are some of my favorite ones. But unapologetically, I love Executioner Song. But Infinity Gauntlet is probably the one where I know the best how you have a big crossover of all the characters and how it played out in the linear storylines. Because I was reading the Doctor Strange comics at the time. So you had a side story where sort of kind of like the end of Infinity War. That was the beginning of Infinity Gauntlet, essentially. The characters get obliterated, everybody fights Thanos, Thanos kills the remaining, most of the remaining heroes. Doctor Strange had this mission where he had to go find whoever he could find and create a new team based on whoever he could find. And so he had this mission for a couple months. And the original Infinity Gauntlet was only 6 issues, which compared to a lot of crossovers these days, that's so tiny. Crossovers might be 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 issues, something like that. Maybe not that many. Some of them are. 52 was 52 issues, but that wasn't really a crossover. But so you have stories like that where it's successfully, according to my nostalgic remembrance of being 12, or however old I was. It was successful. It worked. It didn't interrupt the Doctor Strange storyline too much. It was very integral to the plot. If you just read Infinity Gauntlet, you'll see all these characters show up all of a sudden. Where did they come from? I thought they were dead, and that plays out in the Doctor Strange storyline. And that could be frustrating, but it's designed. It could be frustrating if you're just reading the crossover, but it's designed with a business purpose in mind, where it's designed to get you to buy the comics where this other storyline's going on. It totally worked for me. It got me addicted to Doctor Strange for many, many years. But you compare that to something like, okay, there might be some rattling. Maggie's going to be chewing something metal. If that gets noisy, I'll take it away. So you compare that to something like Civil War, as I said, is like the big iconic one everybody points to in the contemporary period as the really iconic one. And I unapologetically, I never liked Civil War. I think the Captain America movie, Captain America Civil War, surprisingly does a much better job with the story. And I think one of the complaints, or there are many complaints, but one of the complaints is that character-wise, it doesn't work. People will question why does Iron Man act the way that he does? So it fails on a character level. Why do any of the characters act the way they do? And that tends to be the complaint. It is big and expansive, and you hear complaints about that where it's just too big and too epic and too long and what have you. And I think that's the sort of thing that might be sort of burdensome at the time, but you look back on it positively, which might explain why people look back on Secret Invasion positively, surprisingly. But yeah, I mean, so Civil War, the comic that I know, Doctor Strange had been canceled at the time, unfortunately. But the comic that I know that was going linearly at the time, that integrated with it really, really well was the Thunderbolts. And that was a case where Mark Millar, some people pronounce it Millar, but I've heard it's actually pronounced Miller. It's Millar. For whatever reason, I feel necessary to explain that, in case you think I'm mispronouncing his name. But Mark Millar was really, really in charge of all of Civil War. And so a lot of the character misunderstandings you can really attribute to him. Brian Michael Bendis did a lot of that too. He did a lot of those crossovers, and he struggled to really understand characters a lot of the times too. Unfortunately, Doctor Strange being one of the major ones that Bendis didn't understand. That's a whole other video. Bendis not understanding Doctor Strange. That could certainly be a whole video. But I think one of the best examples of the linear storyline fitting with that crossover structure is the way Thunderbolts fit into Civil War. And Mark Millar clearly didn't really, I mean, from what I could tell, he didn't understand what Thunderbolts was. Because, Civil War, it's the actual comic, it plays out in a much, much bigger scale to what the Captain America movie is. Because the movie involved 5 people versus 5 people, 7 people versus 7 people, or whatever it was. But the comic was everybody versus everybody. And Iron Man's side gets the Thunderbolts to hunt down heroes. This might get loud. And that plays out in the actual main Civil War comic as Iron Man says, here's the surprise. We've hired the Thunderbolts. And the Thunderbolts get simplified as being the Marvel's Suicide Squad, which it isn't, really. The Warren Ellis run that followed it was a great run. I enjoyed it very much. But it was just basically, at that point, it was Marvel Suicide Squad. But the Thunderbolts was, it was sort of, kind of like Suicide Squad. It was villains who were trying to redeem themselves by becoming heroes. But the way Iron Man presented it in Civil War, it was just a bunch of villains who are evil and want to kill everyone. Which was a profound misunderstanding of what the Thunderbolts was, or who the Thunderbolts were. But in the actual comic, Fabian, and I definitely don't know how to pronounce his name, Fabian Nicieza, or however you pronounce his name, he was writing it at the time, and he was building up this whole cosmic storyline of Baron Zemo gaining godhood. And Baron Zemo is the main villain, arguably, in the Captain America Civil War. Daniel Bruhl plays him in the movie version. But he's in the comic book version, he's really just the leader of the Thunderbolts, and he gained this godlike power and he's preparing for this great cosmic battle. So if you imagine, Mark Miller has this political allegory planned where everybody is fighting everybody in this, hugely political sort of plot-driven story. Plot-driven story, definitely. And then over here, the Thunderbolts has this linear story that's been building up for a while, where Baron Zemo has this godlike power, and he's building up for this cosmic battle. And the way that they did it was that Iron Man hiring the villains to hunt down the heroes is actually part of Baron Zemo's plan in this brilliant way to build up this army in order to fight this cosmic battle. So Baron Zemo has no interest in hunting down the heroes. If Thunderbolts had just been the Suicide Squad, that would make a huge amount of sense that the Thunderbolts would want to do that in this very villainous way. But, the way that Fabian Nicieza, if that's how you pronounce his name, develops that storyline, it ends up making perfect sense that this linear storyline and this, big crossover logically makes sense and tell a very different story, so it's different from how Doctor Strange did it, where he was a side story, finding all of these dead heroes. It was a very, very different story that was happening at the same time as the main story. The main story that was misunderstanding the characters, and Fabian, last name, giving a totally valid, believable, character-based explanation of why they would appear so differently in Mark Miller's version of it. And I thought, Thunderbolts is one of the most underrated comics of that era. And you even had a great character moment, and this is one of those things, sort of a missed opportunity in Endgame, but you have a great character moment between Baron Zemo and Captain America, where, at this point, Baron Zemo has this godlike sentience, omniscience, not sentience. He has sentience. Omniscience. And, he is no longer dedicated to his old Hydra ideologies. And so Captain America is the rebelling against the what they call the Sokovia Accords, in the movies. But he's rebelling against Iron Man's forces, and that whole storyline's playing out in some sloppy, awkward ways. But in the Thunderbolts, Baron Zemo hunts him down really easily because he's omniscient. And he has this whole really emotional moment of apologizing to Captain America. And he can beat Captain America easily for the first time because, Baron Zemo just generally is this character who's always getting beaten by Captain America. He's a punching bag, basically. He has these big plans. I mean, he's one of the better of the punching bags, but he's, just always beaten, of course. So Zemo could beat Captain America easily, but he basically apologizes for all of the horrible things that he's done. And, arguably the only real emotional moment in all of Civil War. I mean, you can look at Captain America getting assassinated later, and the whole scene of Iron Man, at his bedside, which happened after Civil War. But for the most part, if you say, what are some intensely emotional moments in Civil War? Killing off Goliath, really awkward, forced sort of, let's bring back this character we haven't used for a while, and then have this fake Thor kill him off. There's so many problems with Civil War. That's one of my least favorite parts of Civil War. So my point is, the structure has tremendous amount of potential for experimentation. A far more complicated sort of a structure than you tend to see in pretty much any other narrative form just being introduced into film via the Marvel characters, and succeeding very well. I mean, the MCU is an example of where that's working really, really well. Hasn't always worked in the comics. It can work in the comics, like Infinity Gauntlet. Definitely works in the comics in Infinity Gauntlet. Very frequently, it will fail, but that doesn't mean it's a bad form. That just means it's very, very difficult to do well. So I do see a lot of potential in things like that. And it's evolved. So, I mean, it evolved, arguably, Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars, probably the most complicated of all of the crossovers. It's sort of riffing on the approach to crossovers that the X-Men did with Age of Apocalypse, which was, in the 90s, really the most popular of the X-Men, the most well-regarded, I should say, of the X-Men crossovers. Their strategy was to do essentially a DC-like reboot, but briefly. So they essentially rebooted all their comics for, I think it was 4 months or something like that. Gave it a different world, and then went back to the status quo with a few leftover characters here and there. And Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars did that just across the board. The closest they got to an actual crisis on Infinite Earths. And a big reason to do the full reboot is because of continuity errors that pop up because of that linear structure. But Age of Apocalypse as a story was well regarded because it was huge, complicated. It had its own linear parallel storylines for 4 months or however long. It had beginning, middle, and end very cohesively. It was very much character driven. All of the different X-Men characters were acting in character. They were in a different circumstance. So a character like Cyclops, who has gone through a whole really complicated character development over the past decade to turn him into essentially a junior Magneto. That was really the first time he got to explore the darker side, but it was totally in keeping with the character for sure. But that one interrupted a lot of linear stories, and that one in particular, I was reading Generation X, which was one of my favorite X-Men comics at the time. It still, arguably holds up, I would argue. Which just started. It was I think issue 4 when it got essentially rebooted into Generation Next or whatever they called it. And so they just started a storyline, and then they had to cut it off. But that was true with all of the X-Men stories. They had to sort of cut it off in the middle. But it was designed so that would work. So, like the Wolverine comic, they had all these cliffhangers. The Wolverine comic, he had just stabbed Sabretooth in the head, and then it cut to Age of Apocalypse. So I think they did a lot of that sort of stuff consciously to create these cliffhangers and say, tune in again in 5 months or whatever. But that's one of those sort of approaches that you might think might be kind of hard to integrate into fiction, but that's one of the things that I've been experimenting with. One thing that's hard to recreate in fiction, you can certainly recreate it, but just a lot of the dynamics of that are hard to recreate in fiction unless you had a linearly published serialized story. And you can have that, you can have that certainly. A lot of Dickens stories, for example, were serialized. So you would have to have something like, 5, 6, 7, 8 Dickens stories being serialized and all sharing the same universe. Or Thomas Hardy, that's a story universe. I mean, story universes are not new or anything like that. They're not exclusive to comics. Yoknapatafa, if you have Yoknapatafa has a big crossover or something like that. So you have all these Thomas Hardy stories being serialized simultaneously, and then they meld together, where Tess and Jude have a battle to see who wins. I don't know. That'd be ridiculous. But that might be the next Alan Moore comic. But it's kind of hard to simulate that. But that's what I'm trying to do. I serialize story chapters on social media, and I have 30 going right now. 30 going right now. And so every November, this is sort of me building up to November. Every November for NaNoWriMo, I've sort of been going back and forth between just starting actual novels. I never finish a novel in November, but just the occasion, I take the occasion to start one. But either starting a novel or doing a crossover, which is fun to experiment with. I think my second NaNoWriMo was called Seven Mountain Echo Chambers Collapse. And so when I say I've written 14 novels, it's hard to really categorize a crossover, because if you look at it's Epic Seven Mountain. Hold on, I don't know why it's hard to say. Epic. My dogs just looked at me. Epic Seven Mountains Echo Chamber Collapse. There you go. I need a better title because that is hard to say. But if you look at the actual text, it is as long as a novel. 40,000 plus words. I'm not sure exactly. But just the nature of that one, I had a bunch of linear, parallel, serialized stories, and I crossed them over. So I had one called Foreign Planets, which was this outer space romp, this wild, randomly structured outer space romp. I had one with Old God and the Broken Heart, who I've talked about on other episodes. I had, this was a couple of years ago. This was 6 years ago. And I have not edited that one with any sort of focus. So I don't remember exactly all the characters that I had. But I had all these different characters that were at least 3 different storylines that I was trying to cross over. Oh, and also I was doing a novel called Fertile Crescent, part of the Slaughterbox's mystery stories. I was doing a mystery novel called Fertile Crescent, and that was especially hard to figure out how to integrate because how do you, and it had been going for a while, how do you actually integrate a linearly progressing, legitimately singular focused novel? You can do that easily with, an outer space romp that's randomly structured, like Foreign Planets. Plus, I integrated a lot of time travel stuff, because, why not? That's how Marvel does it a lot of the time, too. That's how Age of Apocalypse happened. So what I did, and the strategy for making that work as a crossover is it was 7 mountains. So it was 7 different mountains, 7 different just quirky sort of mountains. And so I had, the main characters of Foreign Planets and Old God and the Broken Heart and all these different other characters sort of converging on these different mountains, and collapsing them, as the title suggests. Sort of a spoiler in the title. They're fighting these villains. It was a superhero-y sort of a story. Because it's a crossover. Why not? So how do you do that in a mystery novel? Well, I had this character. It's sort of an anticlimactic sort of development as a mystery, because I had this character that I identified as the killer pretty early on. He identified himself as Murder God, and so he wrote this manuscript he wrote this biography, basically, called Birth of a Murder God. And he was, it's this self-aggrandizing thing where he's he's saying he's going to build a mountain out of corpses, basically. And so, that was one of the 7 mountains. So just that manuscript integrated into the crossover, and he as a character showed up in in the crossover, even though in the actual murder mystery he's just isolated there. I think I killed him off. I think I killed him off in both stories, and that's a continuity error, and that's something I'm also fascinated with, because I'll do continuity errors on purpose, just for fun. Like one I'm dealing with now, that I thought, wait a second, that's a continuity error. I have a character named Harriet who grew up out in the woods, and in Metacarpals, which is one of my linear serialized novels, she was raised by magical sentient piece of cloth named Patchalot. And then I have a story called Opal Bean, where she's raised by all the trees, and she's raised by this magical opal bean, living opal bean character. So I said, that's a continuity error. How do I actually make that cohere? Then I realized it's kind of fun just do purposeful continuity errors. So my later editors, who will be my grandkids, if you're reading through my stories and you say, I wonder why he has his continuity errors. It was for fun, and I don't care. I recognize why comic book fans are obsessed over that. It bothers me when Brian Michael Bendis disregards, Doctor Strange continuity all the time. But, in terms of, when did a character die, I don't care. He died a couple different ways. At a couple different times. I don't know if there's any reason to keep that consistent necessarily. That's, comic books will do that. They'll kill somebody off and then they'll bring them back and have this weak explanation for why they came back. But anyway, that was 7 Mountain Echo Chamber. And then I did one called, I started calling it Star Wars just because I like stealing titles. I'm writing Little Women, and I wanted to rewrite Star Wars. I ended up changing the name to Storchworks, which is another hard one to say. But that one was fun to figure out how to do as a crossover. Because I had Metacarpals, for example. It was relatively easy to do that one just because it was sort of a serialized structure at the beginning, where it was about, I've mentioned this in other episodes, but it's a novel about this character with different worlds inside of his fingers, and so the first part of the book is really about all of these different worlds. So I just timed it so that the Storchworks crossover corresponded with the Fader and the Living Moon. I'm trying to remember which finger it is. It's one of the middle fingers. Left middle finger, there you go. Fader and the Living Moon part, which corresponded and had all of these different elements. It was a self-contained story, but it had all of these elements that branched off into, the crossover itself, including the character Murder God, his name is Ford Fordham, ended up being in Fader and just by coincidence, Fader and the Living Moon, and ended up leaving one story and going into Fader and the Living Moon. But the way I handled it, I also had another novel, which was roughly linear, called Colony of the Horizontal Tree, which is still going on. Colony of the Horizontal Tree is another one of the Far Colony has foreign planets and Colony of the Horizontal Tree. And that one was kind of tricky because that one was relatively linear, and so I had one of the characters telling the story of her history, or the colony reads it. He finds a book that was written about her, and she's the main character of that section. And I had one called Moloch the Loveless, which is still unfinished, but it was kind of randomly structured so that it ended up being very episodic. I'll probably have enough of that to be a novel too, but who knows if and how and when it will ever end, I don't know. So it was sort of 3 different parts. I think it was only 3. I say that now, but I think there might have been a fourth part. But it's sort of three different parts. One of them was this character from Colony of the Horizontal Tree. It was Moloch the Loveless, and it was Fader in the Living Moon. And they were going around these sky islands and sort of, hopping around and just missing each other for the most part. So that was one of the crossovers that I did. But those are pretty fun, and the structure is very complicated. And what I'm really interested in as a challenge is really complicated structures. I've talked about this before, where I was very unfulfilled by the amount of challenges that I had in my creative writing education. So I'm constantly giving myself challenges and trying to invent as many new forms as I possibly can. Including the echo chamber. Just on the micro scale, the serialized story parts elements will echo from one to the other. And so, I'm trying to figure out what I might do in November. To my millions of fans out there who watched all the way to the end, smash that like button, like, share, and subscribe. Let me know what I should do, because I have 30 stories going right now, and I call them the Opal Bean War, and it seems kind of obvious that eventually I'll have to say what the Opal Bean War is, but I came up with that name. Part of what was appealing about it was I didn't know what it was, because I have these characters named the Opal Beans. One of the things that connects all of these stories is a series of these different plants that are also stones at the same time. So I have a story called, one of the 30 stories, the actual Opal Bean stories there's 27. One of the 27 stories, I think I have ultimately 33 stories going right now. Well, one of the 27 stories is called Marbleberry Glottal. Here's another tongue twister. Marbleberry Glottal Alchemy. It's about a guy finding marbleberries and creating this sort of alchemy out of it. I have another one called Candle Nut, which, that's an element that shows up in a bunch of stories, where the candle nut powers things and gives inanimate objects sentience and stuff like that. So Opal Bean War probably has something to do with that. I don't know, but you have no obligation to know what your story is about as you're writing it. But, maybe in November, I think if I tried to cross over 27 stories, it might end up being a mess. Seven Mountains Echo Chamber Collapse. Huge mess, but fun to write. Big sprawling mess, but fun to write. Storage Works. Big sprawling mess. Fun to write. Crossovers, big sprawling mess, just by their very nature, just by their structure. Huge mess. Big sprawling epic craziness, but tons of fun. I would recommend that structure for other fiction writers, but I recommend all kinds of experimental forms for other fiction writers all the time. I don't expect them necessarily to integrate them, like the Twitter fiction and Facebook fiction and Pinterest fiction and Wikipedia fiction and Instagram fiction, stuff like that. I recommend it. It's tons of fun. I love to do it, but I don't expect other people to try it necessarily. But I know for certain that if I tried to cross over 27 stories, it's going to be a big, huge, epic, crazy mess, and I don't know if I want to interrupt all 27. That's the thing. That's part of the complication of the crossover. I found a way to do that with Fertile Crescent that worked fine with me. I loved it. I found a way to do that with Colony of the Horizontal Tree. Worked great. I loved it. Those are linear storylines that were kind of tricky to interrupt. Thunderbolts did it very well. Doctor Strange did it very well. But a majority of the time, most of the time when you interrupt that linear flow of a storyline, it's obnoxious. Most of the time. those are exceptions. Thunderbolt's doing it well. Doctor Strange doing it well. Those are a very, very small number. There are a handful of others that do really well. That's a very, very small number of comics that have done it well. And I've got lucky, knock on wood, gotten lucky that those crossovers in the past, I found a way to do it that satisfied me. But I could just imagine trying to do that with 27 stories. So I might ultimately pick just a handful of stories to cross over. I think I definitely wanted, I have no idea what the crossover is going to be, but I think I definitely want to do some kind of crossover. I know the NaNoWriMo people just, love to support each other, so maybe I'll make a, once I figure out my NaNoWriMo, and I think the reason I started doing this for NaNoWriMo, whenever I heard about NaNoWriMo, it's a way of National Novel Writing Month. It's a way of forcing people who always wanted to write a novel to commit to trying to do that in a month. And at that point, when I first heard of it, I'd written 5 or 6 or 7 novels already, and so I thought, oh, that's kind of mundane for me because I'm magnificent. I'm so great because I write so many. I did a post about that, I in case you forgot how special I am, here's how I'm so special. But it's kind of hard to communicate a tone when you do that. It's kind of hard to communicate a vocal tone. So that's what I intended it to sound like. I'm very special, in case you ever forgot. Look at me. But anyway, just literally. From an entirely personal perspective, when I heard about NaNoWriMo, I thought, writing a novel, I've done that. It's a joy and a passion and the love of my life, but it's not something I have to force myself to do. It's something I would do constantly anyway. So in order to interest myself by creating a complicated challenge, that's how I decided, the narrative form that I think would work really well for more conventional written fiction is the crossover. I have these serialized stories going. I have a novel going. Like the first time I did it, I was in the middle of 2 novels. Just 2 novels. And I thought, instead of writing a new novel, I create this new form that, I've never seen before. Never seen anyone do in fiction before. Not the shared universe necessarily. There's plenty of examples of that. But taking that shared universe with that parallel linear serialization, which, who else has done that? I'm not really sure. And then crossing that over. And so, keeping myself interested in constantly innovating new things and trying new things, I decided to invent the prose fiction shared universes crossover. Isn't that exciting, Bo? Hey, Bo. Are you excited about me inventing another new type of story? Aren't I special? I'm very special, right? You think I'm special? I'll just extract me desperately trying to get my cat to call me special and say, here's what my friend the Rainbow Circle is about. Me desperately trying to get my cat to tell me that I'm special. Of course she doesn't think I'm special. She's a cat. So we'll wrap it up for today. I will let you know if I come up with a NaNoWriMo. Say bye, Bo. Nope, still not interested. Okay, see you next time.